They called my home a pile of idle bricks, and they called me a bottleneck, and they said a decent mother wouldn't keep equity hostage from her own blood. I remember every syllable because my daughter didn't raise her voice when she said it. She laid those words down like napkins at a table she was setting for a feast she hadn't paid for, with that calm, hygienic certainty people use when they want to sound reasonable while they empty your pockets. I'm 81, and I still sleep on the right side of the bed, even though no one has reached for the left pillow in almost 20 years. I still oil the porch swing chain at the end of each April, so it won't squeal when the lilacs open. I still keep the kettle on the back burner because I like water that takes its time changing its mind. And I still live in this brick house on the corner, the one with the restless maple and the soft dent on the third step, where my late husband used to pause with the mail. I'm not a dragon guarding a cave of gold. I'm a woman with a mortgage that's long been paid, and a roof I've replaced twice, and a garden I coaxed into obeying the seasons. If I run my palm along the banister, I can feel where balloon strings rubbed the varnish dull on birthdays that nobody photographs anymore. And when I open the linen closet, I still catch the faint ghost of the detergent brand his shirts loved best. And I'm telling you all of this because my house remembers me even when my daughter pretends not to. I'm not naive, not anymore. I know the fashion now is to say that we must unburden ourselves of objects, that square footage is a kind of moral failure, that a woman who lives alone in 2 bedrooms is a hoarder of space and a thief of opportunity. And I know there are think pieces about downsizing and joy sparking and how an optimized footprint will make your heart lighter. But I also know the names of the people whose lives were measured here, and I know the sound the hallway makes when children run through it in socks, and I know the storm pattern of this roof better than any weather app. My daughter came with spreadsheets and glossy renderings and the vocabulary of certainty, telling me that Cedar Falls needs a sanctuary where people can purchase wellness by the ounce, that her concept honors the land and the body and the planet, and an aesthetic that looks very good in photographs. And she told me this house could be more than a museum to my memories, that it could become seed for something luminous. And she said luminous like it had interest rates and a trademark. And when I said I would prefer to die under my own shingles, she smiled the way veterinarians smile when they say the kindest thing is the needle. I am not a villain, though it would make this easier if I were. I am meticulous, and I am stubborn, and sometimes I forget the names of people I taught to tie their shoes, but I remember the texture of love, and it has never felt like a term sheet, and I'm tired of being spoken to like sentimental mold that needs scraping. On the mornings when the air is clear and my joints behave, I put the aluminum kettle on the stove and listen for the low, patient murmur that says it will boil in its own time. The curtains breathe in and out with whatever the window decides to let through, and the floor knows the weight of my feet and the choreography of my patience, and in that quiet, I count the ways I have been told to be reasonable. It began a season ago with little probes like dental picks. Mom, you don't need the front room anymore, do you? And, Mom, I worry about you alone in storms. And, Mom, it's not safe to keep that much capital sitting in drywall. And then the precision instruments arrived, the pie charts shaped like friendly candy, and the neutral fonts that say, nobody is angry, just rational, just efficient. And she sat where her father used to sit and leaned forward with her competent hands and said, we could move you into a place that's designed for your age with rails and alarms and people. And I said, I already have rails. And she said, professionals, Mom. And I said, my neighbors are professionals at knocking when they see the porch light on after midnight. and we both smiled the kind of smile that knows how sharp it is. I am not pretending I never asked for help. I have stood at this sink on nights when the ache in my hip lit like a flare and wished there were a second pair of hands for the heavy pot. And I have counted pills twice because the line between yesterday and tomorrow gets slippery after sunset. And I have watched a spider take over the corner above the pantry and decided to let her have it because her web is prettier than any lace I own. And I have phoned my daughter to say, the oak by the curb looks tired, and she has said, Mom, I'm in a meeting. And I have said, I know, darling. I just wanted to hear your meeting voice. And we have hung up with the ritual of people who love each other without liking what the other loves. I am not perfect. I have opinions about herbs that should never be liquefied, and I speak them like verdicts, and I save buttons in a jam jar because life is a long garment, and you never know which fastener will fail. And I have told my daughter that serenity cannot be retailed by the ounce, and she has told me that I am unkind to progress. I am not. I just know the shape of progress when it happens, and it never arrives with a script that already has my lines crossed out. If you would like to know where I am now, I am here, at the small kitchen table with the heat ring only I can forgive, with the notepad where I still write names for the day's errands as if there were armies to feed, with the envelope of property taxes filed beneath the red elastic band because order is a form of prayer, and with the picture of my daughter at 9, gap-toothed and sunburned, holding a hose and laughing at a rainbow bent into the maple's shade. And I keep that picture in sight, so I remember what love looked like before it learned the tricks of leverage. There are people who will say that an old woman cannot feel the economy pressing its thumb into the soft of her life. But I can. I can feel the push in the price of eggs and in the way the mailman says, "Good morning," like a question, and in the way neighbors move more quickly now past my fence, as if age could be catching, and I can feel it in the newly polite tone my daughter uses, the softened consonants that arrive when a person wants what you have and would prefer that you hand it over without a scene. I have no taste for scenes. I have the taste for stew that sits all afternoon, and for soap that smells like clean, not like Bergamot's idea of an apology, and for the music of a drawer sliding open on wood that was sanded by someone who believed in hands. And I have the taste for choosing myself without an audience. So I begin here, with the sentence she gave me like a gift that turned out to be a knife, with the inside of my mouth still nicked from the sharp of it, with the porch swing steady, and the kettle near the shiver of a whistle, with the thin winter light laying a pale coin on the floorboards, with my body learning a new grammar for saying no without becoming stone, and with my house, my stubborn, ordinary, breathing house, answering back in soft creaks that mean we are still here. If I have a flaw, it is that I believed the contract of motherhood did not include footnotes, that you poured and some of it stayed poured, that your name would remain attached to the good china of people's memory. And I am learning, late, that the text is revised by each generation with whatever fonts they can afford, and sometimes they remove your name for aesthetic reasons, and sometimes they call it modern. But revision is not erasure if the paper refuses to be blank, and I refuse, and my paper is brick and joist and plaster and a patch of earth where the peonies insist on living no matter who forgets to admire them. I am 8 decades old. I am not a vault, and I am not a villain, and I am not a saint. I am a woman with keys that still turn, with a back that still negotiates the stairs one railing at a time, with a mind that still remembers the serial number of a Singer machine that fed a family one hem at a time. And I am introducing myself to you with the truth my daughter prefers I stylize. She said a good mother would liquefy her life to fund her child's idea of success. And I said a good daughter would bring her children to their grandmother on Sunday, even when she is angry. And then we looked at each other across a table and realized we were speaking different languages. I live alone now, but not in an empty house. It is furnished with the patience of years and the precise width of the sun as it walks across the floor at 4 in the afternoon. And if you hear a firmness in my voice, it is because I have finally understood that keeping what you have built is not hoarding, it is honoring. And there is a difference that matters even if nobody writes it into a business plan. The day the betrayal took its full shape was not loud, not cinematic, not even particularly stormy. It was a Tuesday that smelled faintly of overripe pears and dish soap, and I remember thinking how ordinary the sky looked, the way it always does, before something small but irreversible rearranges the furniture inside your life. Sarah arrived just after lunch, her hair tied in that deliberate way that pretends to be casual, her car still humming in the driveway, music leaking out from the open window like perfume. She was wearing beige, the color of calm negotiations, and she carried a leather folder that made a sound when she set it down on the table, a gentle thud with the weight of finality in it. She kissed my cheek quickly, already halfway into her pitch before her coat sleeves had time to settle. "I've found the perfect location," she said, her voice bright and disciplined. "Downtown, near the yoga studios, close to the farmer's market, high visibility, low competition." I poured coffee while she talked, black for me, oat milk for her, though she would only take a sip because caffeine was, she said, an obstacle to vibrational clarity. I had heard this before, the cadence of certainty, the vocabulary of investment decks dressed in love. She spoke of community, sustainability, ethical sourcing, words that once meant tenderness and now meant collateral. I listened because that is what mothers do. We listen as our children narrate the empire of their next beginning. We nod as if every dream were built on foundations that could bear weight. But when she opened the folder, I saw the blueprints, the investor outlines, the empty column titled Primary Contribution. And in that column, neatly typed, was one word: home. At first, I didn't understand. She had used that word so easily, like a pronoun, like something public and flexible. I asked, "What does that mean exactly?" And she smiled the kind of smile people learn in management training, where warmth is rehearsed and disagreement is a line item. "It means, Mom, we sell this place. We free up capital. You'll move in with us. There's plenty of room. We'll convert the downstairs guest suite. You'll have family around. The kids will love it. And you'll be part of something bigger." I could hear the echo of my husband in my head then, laughing at the phrase, something bigger. He used to say everything begins to rot the moment people start calling it a vision instead of a plan. I tried to keep my tone steady. "You want me to sell the house?" She leaned forward, her eyes wide with that strange mixture of pity and impatience reserved for the old who don't yet understand that their lives have become redundant. "Not want, Mom. Need. The bank wants a personal investment. If I can show them that I've secured assets, real ones, they'll triple the loan. It's not just for me. It's for us. For the family's legacy." Legacy. That word that smells of furniture polish and manipulation. I asked her if she knew what it cost to replace the roof, if she remembered who stripped the old wallpaper, If she had any memory of her father sanding the porch rail in August heat, while she sat eating popsicles he bought with the overtime bonus. She didn't answer. She looked at me like those memories were sentimental liabilities, like a portfolio too heavy with nostalgia. I have been underestimated in many dialects over my lifetime, by bank clerks who called me dear, by salesmen who explained interest rates like fairy tales, but never before by my own child with such precision. She had rehearsed this, perhaps even believed she was saving me from solitude. "You'd still have your things," she said, as if affection could be boxed and labeled. "You'd have the kids. You'd be part of everything." She used the word part as though I had been a disassembled appliance waiting for reintegration. I asked her quietly, "What if I don't want to sell?" And for the first time, her smile cracked, revealing the hard machinery beneath the charm. "Mom, don't make this harder than it needs to be. You're sitting on value that's doing nothing. Don't you want to help?" I thought of all the times I had helped. How I sold the gold watch my husband left me to pay her tuition when her scholarship fell through. How I covered the deposit on her first apartment after she said her roommate had backed out. How I babysat through her divorces and reconciliations and expansions of self. Help had been my mother tongue. And yet, the way she said it now made it sound like a moral debt, like she had been keeping receipts all these years. I told her, as calmly as I could, that the house was not a number to be freed, that I was not an account to be liquidated. She sighed, not dramatically, but with that weary exhalation that young people use when they've decided someone else is standing in the way of progress. "I thought you'd understand," she said, "but you're still living in the past." She closed the folder and stood up, brushing imaginary dust from her sleeves as though our conversation had left residue. When she left, the air stayed open behind her, cold and clean like a wound. I sat at the table for a long time, the smell of her perfume, something citrus and clinical, lingering above the steam of my coffee. The folder's outline of her dream burned through my thoughts, bright with all the ways love can disguise conquest. The word home on that page wasn't mine anymore. It had become a placeholder for her ambition, a token she meant to spend. I went out to the garden, needing air that wasn't rehearsed. The peonies were just starting to yellow at the edges, early surrender to heat. I touched the soil, cool and forgiving, and thought how long it had taken for this earth to accept me as part of its rhythm. You can't buy that, can't relocate it, can't brand it. I heard her car engine start, the sharp click of her turn signal as she drove away, already moving toward another appointment where she'd present confidence like scripture. The next day she didn't call, nor the day after. When I phoned her to ask if the children might come by, her assistant answered, polite and remote, said she was in meetings all day, and no, she hadn't mentioned any visit. The silence began to grow roots then. It was quiet at first, then thicker, until even the mail seemed to arrive more softly. A week later, I found a letter in my mailbox, typed, not handwritten. A polite thank you for considering her proposal, a request for me to revisit the decision after reflecting on how shared investment strengthens family bonds. The tone was corporate, but the signature was in her looping script, a small flourish at the end, like an apology she'd forgotten to write. I folded it neatly, placed it inside the recipe book her father gave me the year she was born. That night, I dreamed of the first time we brought her home from the hospital, how tiny she looked against the white sheets, how her fingers opened and closed like she was already rehearsing ownership. I woke up before dawn, the sound of rain tapping against the gutter, and thought, this is how people disappear without dying. They are reasoned out of relevance by the ones they raised. The next Sunday, the pastor's sermon was about stewardship, about how everything we possess is only ever borrowed from the next generation. The congregation nodded, righteous and well-fed, and I sat there tasting iron in my mouth. I looked at the stained glass above the altar, light bending through blue and gold, and wondered if my daughter had already measured where my life ended and her expansion began. When I returned home, the answering machine blinked once. Her voice, careful, composed. Mom, I didn't mean to upset you. Think about it, please. This could change everything. She was right. It already had. The next morning, I stood by the window as the mail truck rolled by and thought of how betrayal rarely arrives as cruelty. More often it comes dressed as reason, with clean hands and a plan for your comfort. That was the day I stopped calling it persuasion and started calling it what it was, an eviction in polite language. I set the folder she'd left behind in the back of the cupboard behind the flour tin, not to forget, but to remember on my own terms. Every time I reach for the tin to bake, I can feel the edge of her ambition pressing faintly through the metal. It keeps me honest. People imagine betrayal as a blow. Sometimes it's just a conversation that never ends. When she stopped bringing the children, when her texts became quarterly check-ins about health and weather, I realized she'd drawn the new borders of our relationship in that living room. She thought she'd built a map where my house was already marked for sale. And maybe she had, but maps can lie. A house that remembers your laughter is harder to move than she thinks. Still, that was the moment, the Tuesday of pears and dish soap, when the story shifted, when I stopped being mother and became asset, when the word home began to mean two different things, and only one of us understood that one of them was not for sale. The silence that followed was not immediate. It arrived slowly, like fog that takes its time to fill the corners of a valley until you cannot remember what distance ever looked like. At first there were the usual phrases, soft and habitual. Busy week. The kids have a cold. We'll stop by soon. And I accepted them as one accepts the weather, knowing complaint won't change the pattern. But gradually, the intervals between her messages lengthened until the phone sat quiet for entire weeks, then months, a mute object reminding me how much noise love once made. I continued my small rituals, because that is what holds a person together when the world around them begins to lose its manners. I tended to the garden, folded linen, ironed the pillowcases though no one but me would notice, and each morning I checked the mailbox, though I already knew there would be nothing but circulars and bills. It's astonishing how quickly a life can shrink to fit the boundaries of other people's convenience. The first time I realized something had changed irrevocably was when Sarah forgot my birthday. I don't mean she was late or sent a text instead of calling. She forgot entirely. The day passed like a shadow over the garden wall. That evening, I lit a small candle anyway, out of habit more than hope, and ate a slice of the lemon pound cake I had baked because I didn't know how not to mark the day. The next morning, I told myself she must have been overwhelmed, that the children must have had homework or a recital. But part of me, the part that has survived many small abandonments, already knew that forgetting is never accidental. It's a form of training, a rehearsal for absence. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere between us turned into something bureaucratic, full of polite notifications and non-committal language. When she did call, Her voice carried that brittle brightness people use when they speak to customers. She asked about my health with the efficiency of a nurse reading from a checklist, and before I could answer, she would say, "I've got to run, Mom, but we'll talk soon." I learned to let her hang up first so she could feel in control of the goodbye. The grandchildren's voices became rarer, first replaced by excuses, homework, sports, screen time, then by nothing at all. Once I tried to FaceTime, only to be met with a black screen and the automated message, "Unavailable." It took me a full minute to understand that they hadn't heard the call because she hadn't told them to answer. A strange thing happens when the young withdraw their recognition. You begin to doubt your own reflection. I'd catch myself passing the hallway mirror and pausing, as if to confirm I still occupied physical space. It wasn't self-pity, it was curiosity. How does one look when love no longer includes you? Summer arrived heavy and lush, the kind of heat that makes wood expand and doors stick, and the whole house seemed to resist being closed. I spent long afternoons sitting on the porch with a fan and a glass of watered-down lemonade, listening to the hum of distant traffic and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. Everyone around me was busy existing inside the rhythm of their own lives, and I envied them their momentum. I used to move like that once, propelled by schedules and the urgent choreography of motherhood, school lunches, laundry, repairs, late bills. Now the hours dripped by, viscous and deliberate. I began to notice things I had never paid attention to before. The soft complaint of the refrigerator, the way light shifted across the ceiling like an unhurried tide, the particular squeak the porch swing made on humid days. Solitude teaches you to listen for smaller noises, the kind that prove the world hasn't gone entirely still. Yet underneath that attentiveness was an ache that no activity could soften. I missed the random knocks at the door, the disorganized chaos of grandchildren invading every surface. I missed the sight of Sarah in the kitchen, pretending not to need my help while she burned toast or dropped spoons into the sink. You can love someone and still not like what they've become, but it's harder when you realize they might not even like who you were. One afternoon, I decided to make an unannounced visit. It was an impulsive decision, born from a restlessness that even cleaning couldn't cure. I dressed carefully, choosing a floral blouse and the same pearl earrings I wore the day she graduated college, as if fabric and memory could argue on my behalf. The drive to her house took 40 minutes, long enough for me to rehearse all the reasonable things I might say. How I understood her ambitions, how I wanted to see the children, how perhaps we'd both said things the wrong way. I carried a basket of scones still warm from the oven, the smell of butter and raspberry filling the car, hopeful in the way only mothers can be after they've been dismissed. Her neighborhood was newer, cleaner, symmetrical, the kind of place where lawns look as though they're measured by contract. When I parked by the curb, I saw her car in the driveway and felt a brief surge of relief. But before I reached the door, a man I didn't recognize stepped out onto the porch. He was tall, wearing sunglasses and holding a clipboard. "Can I help you?" he asked. I told him I was looking for Sarah. He smiled in that polite, guarded way people do when they're unsure of your social rank. "Mrs. Ellison is out. I'm with the contractor's office, doing some estimates." He hesitated, then added, "We're renovating the guest suite." I nodded, pretending the words didn't land the way they did. Guest suite. My replacement habitat, already in progress. I left the basket on the porch, rang the bell once, and walked back to the car before anyone could see the tremor in my hands. That night, she called. Her voice was sharp, full of restrained fury. "Mom, you can't just show up unannounced. The kids were at practice, and it's awkward when people see you wandering around." Wandering, as if affection were trespassing. I apologized for the inconvenience, and she softened slightly, saying she'd gotten the scones, that they were good, that she'd call soon. She didn't. Weeks folded into each other like unwashed sheets. I began to notice the small betrayals that follow the big one. The neighbors who stopped inviting me to their barbecues because they sensed my loneliness like bad weather. The way people at church spoke slower to me as though grief affected hearing. There's an etiquette to aging that no one teaches you. How to disappear without making others uncomfortable. I started keeping the television on in the evenings, not to watch it, but to have voices in the room. Even commercials for detergents sounded companionable. The first leaves began to fall before I realized I hadn't heard my daughter laugh in almost a year. When I did see her again, it was at the grocery store. I turned into the cereal aisle, and there she was, on the phone, one hand pushing a cart filled with almond milk and frozen dinners. For a moment, I thought of walking past, pretending not to notice. But she looked up, and our eyes met. Surprise flashed across her face, then something else. Panic, perhaps, or guilt trying to hide behind professionalism. She ended the call quickly and kissed my cheek as though performing for surveillance. "Mom, what a coincidence." Her tone was too bright, her grip on the cart too tight. I asked after the children. She said they were fine, busy with school. I said I'd love to see them soon. She smiled and said, "Of course." In that airless way people say things they don't intend to deliver. When we parted, she didn't look back. I stood by the shelf of oatmeal, surrounded by boxes promising heart health, and felt something inside me close like a door with no handle on the other side. After that, I stopped initiating. There is a dignity in silence once you understand it's the only language left that doesn't invite pity. My world contracted further, but also steadied itself. The house became both sanctuary and witness. On evenings when the wind pressed against the windows, I would sit in my husband's old chair and imagine his voice saying, "Let her learn." He always believed that love must be tested by its own absence, that some lessons only bloom in the cold. I wanted to believe he was right, that Sarah's distance was temporary, that one morning she would remember who I was before she recast me as an obstacle. But the weeks turned into seasons, and by the time winter arrived, I understood that waiting can become a form of surrender. I began to collect small moments of defiance instead. I repainted the kitchen cupboards a stubborn shade of blue, fixed the loose step myself, learned how to pay bills online even though she once told me not to touch digital things. Each little act was an assertion, a whisper saying, "I am still here, and I am not done." Yet under that whisper, there was another voice, quieter and older, asking if maybe I had always loved her too much to teach her what gratitude feels like when it costs you nothing. Sometimes at night, I would dream of the house being sold without my consent, of strangers wandering through, admiring the layout, commenting on the vintage charm. In the dream, I followed them from room to room, invisible, pleading for them to see that this was not property, but history, that the faint marks on the doorframe were measurements of growth, not defects. I'd wake with the taste of dust in my mouth, half expecting to find a "for sale" sign staked in the lawn. That fear was irrational, yet it carried the weight of prophecy. Because by then, I knew my daughter well enough to understand that what had begun as persuasion had curdled into strategy. she was waiting me out. And the cruelest part was not her ambition, but her patience. As the year turned, the silence became normal, the way chronic pain becomes background noise. People think estrangement is a rupture, but often it's erosion, minute by minute. Kindness dissolving into indifference until the landscape of your relationship is unrecognizable. I still wrote her Christmas card, though shorter now, stripped of warmth, just "Love, Mom" in my steadier handwriting. She sent one back printed from a service that also mailed her clients, all identical snowflakes and pre-written joy. That was how I learned that affection, too, can be automated. And still I waited, not because I believed she would come, but because hope is a habit you can't quit without shaking. So the days unfolded, one like another, quiet, deliberate. And somewhere in that long stretch of almost nothing, I understood that the worst cruelty isn't when someone stops loving you. It's when they keep pretending that they do, just enough to make you doubt your loneliness. It was in early spring, when the air still carried the scent of thawing soil and the sound of the river deepened at night, that something inside me began to stir. Not hope, not rebellion, something quieter, a kind of internal recalibration. I had spent months existing like an unused room, keeping the lights low so as not to attract attention. But one morning, as the dawn leaked pale and persistent through the kitchen curtains, I realized that survival had rearranged itself into a question. If no one was coming back, what would I do with the time left over? The question wasn't grand or philosophical. It was domestic and practical in the way all real decisions are. It began with a cupboard door that wouldn't close. I took a screwdriver from the drawer, the one my husband had labeled with a piece of masking tape, for small jobs, and fixed the hinge myself. It was nothing, a gesture so modest it barely counted as change. Yet, when the door finally aligned with its frame, I felt something click inside me too, a small sound of ownership returning to its rightful place. I stood there, palm against the wood, feeling foolish and triumphant in equal measure. You spend your life taking care of others, and when the caretaking ends, you forget that maintenance is a language you can still speak on your own behalf. That afternoon, I decided to clear the attic, not for sentimental reasons, but because I needed to see what remained of me that wasn't defined by anyone else's history. The dust rose in halos as I opened boxes. School drawings, tax records, my wedding dress folded inside tissue paper, the color of old teeth. Among the forgotten clutter, I found a leather-bound ledger, the one my husband used to record household expenses, back when every purchase had to be justified. His handwriting, neat and careful, stretched across the yellowed pages. Roof repair 212, school uniforms 45, grocery 32s. Then on the very last page, dated nearly 40 years ago, he had written, "Savings for emergency. Don't forget you have your own account." I'd almost forgotten that he'd set it up for me after his second heart scare, saying a woman should never have to beg permission to feel safe. The bank branch had long since changed names, but I wondered if the account might still exist. The idea felt both absurd and necessary. I brushed the dust from the cover, and for the first time in months, I had a purpose that belonged entirely to me. The next morning, I walked into town. The wind was sharp enough to remind me that I was still made of flesh. At the bank, everything gleamed too brightly, the way places of money always do, full of polite smiles and hidden hierarchies. I asked to speak with someone about an old account. The young man at the counter looked skeptical until I handed him the ledger and my identification. He typed, frowned, typed again, and then looked up with a half smile of surprise. "It's still here, ma'am," he said, dormant but active. He turned the screen toward me, showing a modest sum that had somehow survived the decades. Nothing extravagant, but enough to make my pulse lift. "Would you like to reactivate it?" he asked. I nodded, and when he handed me the new debit card, the plastic felt light and dangerous in my palm, like a secret weapon no one knew I still owned. On the way home, I stopped at the small bakery near the post office, the one that still made eclairs the way I remembered, heavy with custard and unapologetically sweet. I bought 2, ate 1 on a bench outside, and let the sugar dissolve the taste of bitterness that had taken residence on my tongue. The second eclair I wrapped carefully and saved for later, because it seemed important to prove to myself that pleasure could wait and still be mine. That evening, I called an old friend from my teaching days, Eleanor, whom I hadn't spoken to in nearly 10 years. We'd once been close, but as life splintered us into different responsibilities, her grandchildren, my daughter's ambitions, we drifted. She answered on the second ring, her voice still brisk and melodic. We talked for an hour about nothing monumental: her garden, her hip surgery, the ridiculous price of milk. Yet under the surface hum of our conversation was something larger, the recognition of being remembered. Before we hung up, she said, "You sound lighter, Mary. Did something happen?" I told her I fixed a cupboard and found a bank account. She laughed, then said softly, "Maybe that's all it takes to reopen the world." After we hung up, I sat by the window, watching twilight gather across the street, the bare trees turning black against the lavender sky. For the first time in a long while, the silence felt companionable rather than punitive. Days began to stretch into each other, not with monotony, but with a rhythm that was mine to conduct. I started walking every morning, tracing the same route through the neighborhood, down past the closed school and the park where the benches were beginning to rust. Each day I went a little farther. The air smelled of wet bark and new grass, the ground uneven beneath my steps, but the ache in my knees felt purposeful. The woman who owned the corner cafe began to wave when she saw me pass. One morning, she leaned out the door and asked if I'd like to come in for tea. The cafe was small and unpretentious, filled with the warmth of overworked kettles and second-hand furniture. We talked easily. Her name was Lila, a widow younger than me by 20 years, but seasoned by the same vocabulary of endurance. She asked if I ever got lonely, and I told her yes, but I'd started to prefer the company of things that don't ask for explanation. She nodded, refilled my cup, and said, "That's how it begins, the new life. You stop apologizing for existing." I went back the next week, then the one after. The cafe became a sort of anchor, not a destination, but a punctuation mark in my otherwise unclaimed days. It was during one of those mornings that I saw a flyer pinned to the community board near the door. Volunteers needed for reading program at the library. Seniors especially welcome. The phrase made me wince. Seniors especially welcome. But the idea lingered. I'd spent most of my working years teaching English to high school students, and the thought of reading again, of using my voice for something other than silence, tugged at me. That afternoon, I went to the library and filled out the form. The woman behind the counter, a librarian with kind eyes and a streak of gray like a lightning bolt through her hair, thanked me as if I'd done something heroic. The first session was scheduled for Thursday. That night I barely slept, nervous as if I were auditioning for a part in my own forgotten story. Thursday came with rain, I wore my navy coat, the one that had begun to feel like armor, and walked the few blocks to the library. The children's room smelled of glue and crayons, the same smell that used to cling to my classroom. The small circle of kids looked up when I entered, curious, unfiltered, and one of them asked, "Are you somebody's grandma?" I smiled and said, "Yes, I suppose I am." The librarian handed me a book, Charlotte's Web, its cover soft from years of handling. As I began to read, the words felt strange and familiar at once, like a song half remembered. The children listened, eyes wide, and for the first time in months, I felt useful without being used. When the session ended, one of the little girls slipped her hand into mine and whispered, "You sound like stories sound before they end." It was the kindest sentence anyone had said to me in a long time. That evening, as I walked home under the thinning rain, I caught my reflection in a shop window and almost didn't recognize myself. There was color in my face, not from makeup, but from motion. My back was straight, my step deliberate. I realized then that healing doesn't announce itself. It accumulates quietly through small repairs and steady breaths. I made soup that night, the kind that simmers for hours, and ate it by the window while the streetlights flickered on one by one. Somewhere, beyond the silence, my daughter was probably still busy building her next venture, her voice filling conference calls instead of living rooms. I no longer needed to know the details. For years I had been orbiting her life like a retired moon, waiting for gravity to call me back. But now I could feel the faint pull of a different kind of center. Mine. The next morning, I opened the curtains, and the whole house looked brighter, though the weather hadn't changed. It was me who had shifted. The photographs on the mantel no longer seemed like ghosts. They were witnesses. I brewed tea and sat with the newspaper, tracing the headlines with my finger, aware of the simple, exquisite fact that the day belonged to me and me alone. Nothing monumental had happened. No reconciliation, no apology, no miracle, just the slow turning of the wheel that marks the middle of any story worth surviving. And I thought, as I watched the first bird land on the lilac branch outside, that perhaps the truest rebellion of all is simply learning to belong to yourself again. The year turned again, and by the time the first leaves began to dry into parchment on the pavement, I had almost begun to believe that silence might be permanent, that some wounds simply learn to live inside the body as quiet tenants who no longer pay rent but refuse to leave. I had grown used to the stillness of the house, to the rhythm of days that bent gently toward solitude. The garden had become a companion that required no apology. The library sessions, a small but steady reminder that voices, when used with patience, can still build shelter. Then, one late afternoon in September, as I was returning from the market with a bag of apples and the first cranberries of the season, I saw her car in the driveway, parked crookedly as if it had landed there in haste. My heart performed that treacherous double beat of joy and fear. She was sitting on the porch steps, elbows on her knees, head bowed, her hair tied carelessly, her phone face down beside her like an abandoned weapon. When she looked up, I saw something I hadn't seen in her in years. Not arrogance, not resolve, but exhaustion, the kind that lives beneath the skin and hollows the eyes. "Hi, Mom," she said, and her voice cracked on the first syllable. I wanted to rush forward, to gather her in my arms the way I did when she came home with scraped knees, but age has taught me restraint can be a form of mercy. I set the groceries on the railing and said softly, You're early for Thanksgiving." She gave a thin, broken laugh and shook her head. "Don't joke, please. I can't handle jokes right now." I nodded, gestured for her to come inside, and she followed me into the kitchen as though afraid the invitation might be revoked. The moment the door closed behind us, she exhaled in a way that filled the whole room, a breath heavy with failure. She sat at the table, stared at her hands, and after a long silence said, "It's over. The cafe. The investors pulled out. We owe money. I can't even cover the rent this month." Her voice carried none of the bravado that had once dressed her ambition. It was raw, scraped clean of pretense. I poured her tea, though she didn't touch it. "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it in more ways than she could hear. She kept talking, words tumbling like debris in the wake of collapse, about unpaid suppliers, about employees who had left, about her partner who had needed space. She spoke until her sentences began to break down into fragments, and then she stopped, stared at the window, and whispered, "I thought you'd say I told you so." I looked at her, my child, 39 years old and suddenly very small, and said, "You already know I told you so. Saying it would only make me cruel." For a moment she smiled, or something near it, a flicker of recognition between two people who once knew how to love each other without negotiation. Then the smile vanished. "Mom, I need help," she said, and the words landed like stones. "Not for me," she added quickly. "For the kids. We're behind on the condo payments. I don't know where we'll go if—" She didn't finish. I could feel the old reflex rising, the mother's instinct to reach for her wallet before her judgment. But I stayed still, gripping the edge of the table until the urge passed. "You still have the house?" she said quietly, not looking at me. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I answered. "I still have the house." What followed was not a conversation, but a careful fencing match where every sentence was a blade disguised as concern. She told me she was only asking for a loan, that she would pay me back once she found new investors, that this was temporary, that she hated to even ask. I listened, nodding, letting her voice fill the room the way smoke fills a small space, until it was hard to breathe. I thought of the day she'd first come with her proposal, of the glossy folder and the confident tone. Now the same request returned in the dialect of desperation, stripped of marketing, but still heavy with entitlement. I wanted to believe this time was different, that she was asking from humility, but something in her eyes said otherwise. It wasn't need that drove her. It was the fear of losing control. She had built her life on the belief that money was both cure and confession, and now that she had neither, she came to reclaim the illusion of mastery through me. I asked her about the children, where they were. "At a friend's," she said. "They don't know anything yet." I told them we're just reorganizing. The word made me flinch. Reorganizing, as if collapse were a clerical error. I told her she could stay for dinner, that there was stew on the stove, but she shook her head, said she needed to get back before they noticed she was gone. Before she left, she stood in the doorway, fingers brushing the frame like someone memorizing an exit. "I'll figure something out," she said. "I just hoped you might think about it." I wanted to say I already had, for years, but instead I said, "Drive safely." When the sound of her car faded down the street, the house felt suddenly too large again. I sat at the table long after the stew had gone cold, staring at the two bowls, one untouched, and realized that pity, when mixed with memory, tastes a lot like grief. Over the next week, she called twice, each time shorter, each time a little less proud. She told me she had spoken to a lawyer about options. I understood the subtext: bankruptcy, liquidation, negotiation. The word house began to circle our conversations again, not directly, but orbiting, waiting for a chance to land. She mentioned how real estate values had gone up, how selling could solve both our problems, how she could manage the process for me so I wouldn't be overwhelmed. I listened, said little. After the second call, I went to my desk, pulled out the file that held the original deed, and reread the clause my husband had insisted on when we'd paid off the mortgage. Ownership to remain sole and unencumbered, transferable only upon voluntary consent. He had trusted language the way I trusted instinct. That night, I slept poorly, dreaming of doors without locks and rooms filled with strangers. The following Sunday, as I returned from church, I saw an unfamiliar car parked across the street, engine idling. A man in a suit was sitting inside, tapping at his phone. He stepped out as I approached and introduced himself as a realtor. "Mrs. Ellison?" he asked. "Your daughter mentioned you might be interested in an appraisal. Just preliminary." The words hit like a physical shove. I told him firmly that no appraisal was requested, that no sale was planned, and that he should leave immediately. He apologized, flustered, muttered something about miscommunication, and drove off. I stood on the porch watching the car disappear, the air vibrating with the humiliation of being treated like someone whose consent was optional. That evening, I called Sarah. She didn't pick up. I left a message. "Do not send anyone to my house again without my permission. This is not your property." My voice sounded steadier than I felt. She didn't reply. Days passed, then a week. Finally, she called, defensive from the first syllable. "It was just an estimate, Mom. Calm down. I thought you'd want to know what it's worth." I told her I already knew what it was worth, to me, to the life it contained, and that no number could measure that. She said, "You're being unreasonable." I said, "Then let me be." There was a silence so deep I could hear her breathing on the other end. Then she said, "You always make things about you," and hung up. That sentence, so absurd and cruel in its blindness, echoed in my head for days. I found myself repeating it under my breath like a riddle. About you, about you, about you. It struck me then that perhaps she truly believed generosity was something owed, not offered, that love was a kind of credit line to be extended indefinitely. A week later, a letter arrived, not from her, but from a financial consultancy bearing her name as a client. It outlined potential restructuring opportunities involving family-held real estate. I read it 3 times, each word a nail closing the coffin of whatever innocence I had left about her intentions. I didn't cry. Instead, I went to my husband's desk, pulled out the same will we'd drafted decades ago, and began to read it line by line. Near the end was a phrase I'd skimmed before but never truly absorbed. In the event of undue influence or coercion, the property shall be held in trust for the protection of the surviving spouse. It was as if he had anticipated this moment, his foresight folded into the document like a quiet guardian. The next morning, I called our old lawyer, retired now but still lucid, and explained the situation. He listened patiently, then said, "You can amend the trust to ensure the house remains inaccessible during your lifetime. It's not difficult." His voice was calm, professional, almost tender. "Do it, Mary," he said. "People change when money whispers loud enough." I followed his advice. Within a week, the papers were signed, notarized, and filed. The house was placed in a living trust under my control, with clear stipulations that it could not be sold, mortgaged, or transferred until after my death, and only then, according to my explicit instructions. It felt both protective and tragic, like locking a door you once left open for love. That evening, I wrote her a letter. Not a cruel one, not an accusation, but a statement carved from the granite of finality. I told her I wished her well, that I hoped she would find a way to rebuild, but that I could no longer be the foundation for anyone else's empire. I told her the house was no longer an asset. It was a promise, to her father, to myself, that the life we built would not be dismantled for someone else's convenience. I ended with the words, "My door remains open, but my equity does not." I sealed it, mailed it, and waited for whatever silence would follow. Her response arrived not as a letter, but as absence. Weeks passed without a call. I heard from a neighbor that she had moved out of the condo, that she and the children were staying with a friend. I wanted to reach out, to ask about the kids, to offer small comforts, but something restrained me, a weary knowledge that any gesture might be misread as surrender. Instead, I tended the garden, pruned the lilacs, and let the season finish its slow collapse into winter. One evening, while watering the plants under a bruised sky, I noticed the faint smell of wood smoke from a nearby chimney and thought of her as a child again, sitting by the fire with her hair smelling of sleep and apple shampoo. Memory, I've learned, is the most faithful betrayer. It returns sweetness, even when you've stopped asking for it. Months later, just as the frost began to loosen its grip on the ground, she appeared again. No warning, no call. I opened the door to find her standing there with 2 suitcases and the children behind her, awkward and quiet, their eyes flicking between us like small witnesses to a story they didn't understand. "Just for a few days," she said, "until we figure things out." I looked at the children, the boy taller now, the girl clutching a stuffed rabbit missing one ear, and I couldn't say no. They stayed in the guest room. The first nights were uneasy, everyone moving carefully as though the floorboards might judge us. The children thawed first. They laughed at breakfast, helped me in the garden, asked about old photos. But Sarah remained guarded, polite to the point of distance. One night, after they had gone to bed, she stood by the window, looking out at the dark yard. "I didn't mean for it to get like this," she said. "I just thought we could help each other." I wanted to believe her, but the words felt rehearsed, hollowed out by repetition. "We can," I said quietly, "but not with money. Not anymore." The next morning they were gone. No note, no goodbye. Just the indentation of their bodies in the sheets and a half-empty box of cereal on the counter. I stood in the doorway for a long time, the sound of silence pressing close again, heavier this time but also cleaner, like a wound finally closing from the inside. It was then I understood that her leaving was not punishment. It was liberation, disguised as loss. The past had returned one last time to test the walls, to see if they would hold. They did. And for the first time, I didn't feel like a victim of her choices. I felt like the custodian of my own boundary, something she could neither fund nor foreclose. The house, steady around me, seemed to exhale. The air smelled faintly of apples and smoke. I poured myself tea, sat by the window, and realized that sometimes the only way to love a child who cannot stop taking is to give her back her own hunger. It happened quietly, as most endings do, not with confrontation or shouting, but with the sort of stillness that follows a verdict already decided in the hearts of those who must live with it. Winter had begun to melt into that brittle, untrustworthy season when the sun returns, but warmth does not. And every morning, the air smelled faintly of rust and thawing wood. I had begun to imagine that the story between us had reached its natural silence, that no new chapter could possibly appear after so much erasure. But life, with its odd sense of timing, offered one last test. I received a call from a number I did not recognize. It was a man who identified himself as a paralegal from a firm downtown, polite but hesitant. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, "I'm contacting you regarding a power of attorney form your daughter submitted for review. We require your signature to finalize authorization over your estate accounts." For a moment, the world tilted slightly, as though gravity had decided to take a breath. I asked him to repeat it, and he did. Careful, deliberate, the way people speak when they sense the ground under someone else's life shifting. I thanked him, asked him to send the documents for my review, and hung up. I sat there for a long time at the kitchen table, the afternoon light thick and heavy against the curtains, my hands flat against the wood as if to steady myself. I was not surprised. Shock requires innocence, and mine had long since been retired. What I felt instead was something like recognition, the cold, clean awareness that the line between love and exploitation is thinner than a breath. When the envelope arrived 2 days later, I opened it slowly, the way you open a wound that is already scarred but still aches beneath the skin. The language was clinical, elegant, entirely free of emotion. It granted her full control of all assets, to act in the best financial interest of the principal. The word principal struck me hardest. It sounded like a title belonging to someone else, someone theoretical. I read it twice, then 3 times, tracing the outline of her plan with a detached precision that surprised even me. This was not the desperate act of a child cornered by debt. It was an attempt at redefinition, a rewriting of who I was allowed to be. I could see her logic as clearly as if she were sitting across from me explaining it, reasonable, efficient, saying that it was only paperwork, that she was just trying to protect me. She would say that word, protect, with a softness rehearsed from years of practice, and she would believe it too, because power always disguises itself best as care. I placed the papers back in the envelope, wrote across the front in large letters, "Return to sender," and left it by the door. Then I made tea and waited for whatever shape her anger would take this time. She arrived 3 days later, unannounced as always, the sound of her car tires crunching the half-frozen gravel. I knew she was coming the moment the sparrows scattered from the feeder and the air changed its temperature. When I opened the door, she didn't bother with greetings. "Why didn't you sign it?" she asked, her voice sharp but trembling. I stepped aside and gestured toward the living room. "Come in," I said. "You're letting the cold in." She followed, coat still on, eyes bright with the fever of frustration. "It's standard procedure," she said. "You're getting older. You shouldn't be dealing with all this on your own. The accounts, the taxes. What if something happens to you?" I looked at her, at the line between her eyebrows that deepened whenever she lied. "Something already happened to me," I said softly. "You." Her mouth tightened, a small flash of shame crossing her face before pride swallowed it whole. "You think I'm trying to steal from you," she said. "That's ridiculous. I'm trying to make sure you're safe." I smiled, not kindly, but not cruelly either. "Safety is not what you're after, Sarah. You want control. You always have. But control isn't love, and I've given you enough of both." She turned away, pacing, her boots leaving wet marks on the rug. "You don't understand how hard it's been," she said, her voice rising. "Everything I built fell apart, and you just sit here, hoarding memories while I'm drowning." I wanted to reach for her, but I didn't. "It's not drowning when you refuse to swim," I said. "You chose this water." She stopped pacing, looked at me, eyes shining with a fury that was almost admiration. "You've become so cold," she whispered. "So hard." I nodded. Stone keeps houses standing when storms come. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly, measuring the space between us in seconds that felt like centuries. Then she said, "If you sign it, I can fix everything. We can be a family again." The sentence struck me with its cruelty precisely because I knew she believed it. I walked to the desk, opened the drawer, and pulled out the folder containing the trust documents I had filed months earlier. I placed it on the table between us, the sound sharp as a gavel. "It's already fixed," I said. "This house is no longer mine to sell. It cannot be touched, borrowed against, or transferred. It belongs to itself until I'm gone." She stared at the papers, her face emptying of color. "You went behind my back," she said. "No," I replied. "I finally stood in front of myself." Something in her broke then, not loudly, not visibly, but in that internal way people fracture when the last illusion they were clinging to slips from their hands. She sat down, burying her face in her palms, her shoulders trembling not with tears, but with a kind of dry, exhausted rage. I sat opposite her, silent, because sometimes mercy is simply not interrupting someone's reckoning. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red but dry. "You've shut me out," she said. "You've chosen walls over family." I shook my head slowly. "I've chosen peace over performance. There's a difference." She laughed bitterly, that short, jagged sound I used to hear when she was a teenager, cornered by her own lies. "You think you've won," she said, "but you'll die here alone." The sentence should have hurt more than it did. Instead, it felt like a confirmation of what I had already accepted. "Better alone in truth," I said, "than surrounded by people who treat affection like a transaction." She stood then, grabbing her coat, the motion quick and graceless. "You'll regret this," she said. "You'll need me one day." I met her eyes. "If that day comes," I said, "I hope you've learned what help actually means." She left without slamming the door. The restraint made it worse somehow, as if anger had matured into contempt. I watched from the window as her car pulled away, the tail lights shrinking until they dissolved into the gray afternoon. For a long time after, I stood there, the sound of her absence humming through the house like an aftershock. The tea had gone cold on the table. I poured it down the sink, rinsed the cup, and set it back on the shelf. Then I opened the back door, stepped out into the garden, and breathed. The air was sharp enough to sting my lungs, the earth still hard underfoot, but beginning to soften in places where the sun lingered. The lilac bush, stubborn as always, showed the first signs of bud. I touched one gently, felt the promise folded inside its green shell, and thought of how life insists on beginning again, even in places long neglected. For the first time in years, I did not think of her voice or her plans or her disappointment. I thought of my own endurance, not as resistance, but as presence. I was still here, unchanged in all the ways that mattered, altered in the ones that saved me. That night, I lit a single candle on the table, not for prayer, but for clarity. The flame bent slightly in the draft, wavered, then steadied. And in that small movement, I saw the entire story, how every betrayal, every silence, every argument had been pushing me toward this still point of self-possession. The house around me creaked and sighed, an old companion adjusting to peace. I took out my journal and began to write. Not to her, not to anyone, but for myself. I wrote about the hinge I fixed, the bank account I reclaimed, the library children who waited for my voice each week. I wrote about the woman I had been and the one I had quietly become. When I finished, the candle had burned low, wax pooling in the saucer, like the soft punctuation at the end of a long sentence. I closed the book and whispered into the quiet room. It's done. The words did not feel final, but true. And truth, I have learned, is rarely loud. The next morning, I walked to the post office to return the envelope she had sent, the one that had begun this last confrontation. The clerk took it without comment, stamped it, and slid it into the outgoing tray. Watching it disappear was like exhaling a decade's worth of tension. On the way home, I stopped by the cafe where Lila worked, the one with the chipped mugs and the kind laughter. She saw my face and said, "You look different today. Lighter." I told her I had finished something that needed to end. She nodded, poured me coffee, and said, "Endings are just beginnings wearing sensible shoes." We laughed, and the sound felt unfamiliar, but good. I walked home through the cold sunshine, each step deliberate, the pavement glistening with thaw. Inside, the house smelled faintly of wood polish and morning light. I placed my keys on the counter and realized that for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for anyone to return. The air was quiet, but not empty. It was full of my own breath, of the pulse that comes after survival. I looked around at the modest furniture, the soft wear of the walls, the photographs that no longer demanded nostalgia, but offered witness, and I knew with a certainty that required no applause that the war was over, and I had won simply by remaining. Spring returned, the kind that does not announce itself with fireworks, but creeps into the bones of the world like forgiveness, slow and almost imperceptible. The frost on the windows began to retreat each morning, leaving behind faint ghost shapes that dissolved as soon as sunlight touched them, and the earth, which had been locked for so long, loosened its jaw and began to breathe again. I noticed it first in the sound of the birds, how their calls changed from mere endurance to something like celebration, and then in the smell of soil whenever I opened the back door. I had survived the long winter not through hope, but through discipline, the discipline of keeping the house in order, of reading aloud to children who were not my own, of tending to small things that did not ask for my pain. Now, as light returned in long, careful strands, I realized that the ache in me had also thawed into something less sharp, less personal. Grief, I discovered, does not vanish. It simply changes its furniture until one day it fits inside the room of your life without demanding all the space. I began to live differently, though I couldn't have said when the change took root. I woke earlier, not out of restlessness, but curiosity. The mornings had a texture again, the smell of toast, the hush of the kettle before it sighed, the soft groan of the porch steps under my feet. I started keeping a small notebook by the window where I wrote down one sentence each day, nothing grand, just small witnesses to being alive. The lilacs opened early. Rain smells of iron and forgiveness. A neighbor waved through the fence. It became my way of measuring time, not by what was lost, but by what continued. Sometimes while I wrote, I would think of Sarah, not with bitterness, but with a kind of distant compassion that surprised me. I imagined her somewhere in another city, perhaps starting again, perhaps not, but hopefully, learning that love cannot be collateral. I did not reach out. The silence between us had finally settled into its own truth. Neither punishment nor surrender, simply a boundary made visible. One morning in May, a small envelope arrived. There was no return address, only my name written in her familiar, impatient handwriting. Inside was a photograph of the children standing in front of a school project, grinning, their faces stretched with pride. No note, no apology, just that simple offering of existence. I traced the edges of the photo with my thumb and placed it on the mantel beside the one of her as a child holding the garden hose, her laughter frozen in another kind of light. I did not cry. Instead, I whispered a quiet thank you to whatever grace still lived between us, thin but not broken. Sometimes reconciliation doesn't arrive as words or visits. It comes as proof of life, as the smallest reminder that affection, once planted, can survive even the longest drought. The garden flourished that year in ways it hadn't in decades. The peonies multiplied without reason, the lilacs spread toward the porch, and the apple tree that had stopped bearing fruit suddenly filled with blossoms so heavy they bent the branches. I spent my afternoons tending to them, pruning gently, listening to the bees at work, and realizing that nurturing something living had always been my truest language. I no longer waited for the phone to ring or for footsteps on the porch. The absence that had once felt like punishment now felt like space, a clean, breathable expanse where I could finally hear my own thoughts without interruption. There was peace in that, a peace not born of forgetting, but of acceptance. Sometimes, after my sessions at the library, I would walk to the cafe and sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching the young mothers with their children. They looked exhausted and radiant, their arms full of tasks and tiny hands, and I saw myself in them, not with envy, but with tenderness. I wanted to tell them to keep something for themselves, a small room inside untouched by obligation, a part that belongs to no one else. But advice, I've learned, is another form of intrusion. So instead, I smiled when they met my eyes and let them return to their whirl of motion. Each of us learns in our own time what cannot be demanded from love. One evening, near sunset, I walked through the house with the windows open. The air carried the smell of grass and wood smoke, and the light poured in as though the walls had finally agreed to transparency. Every room felt inhabited, even the empty ones. I stopped by the piano, untouched for years, and pressed a single key. The sound lingered, fragile and haunting, like something that knew its own mortality. I sat down and played a slow, uncertain melody. Nothing remembered, just notes finding each other after too much silence. The sound traveled through the rooms, climbed the staircase, and returned to me, softened by distance. For the first time, the house didn't echo. It harmonized. That night, as I sat on the porch, the sky deepened into that particular blue that comes only once a year, just before summer begins. I thought of all that had happened, of the small wars fought behind polite words, of the endurance required to choose dignity over desperation. I understood then that survival is not a victory march. It is a quiet persistence, the act of remaining gentle in a world that has given you every reason not to be. The wind moved through the lilacs, carrying their scent across the yard, and I imagined it traveling farther, perhaps even to wherever she was, a silent message written in perfume. I am still here, and I wish you well. Before going inside, I looked at the house one last time in the fading light. It no longer felt like a fortress or a tomb. It felt like a living witness, a body that had sheltered generations and still had room for one more breath. I whispered goodnight to the walls, a habit I'd formed without noticing, and climbed the stairs slowly, not from pain, but reverence. In the bedroom, I opened the window just enough to let the night enter. The air was cool and forgiving. I lay down and thought of all the women who have been told their worth ended with their usefulness, who have been asked to trade security for approval, who have been erased by the very children they once kept alive. To them, to every invisible survivor, I wanted to send this single truth. You are not a relic of someone else's story. You are the author of your own continuance. When sleep came, it was soft and unguarded, like the kind I knew in childhood before fear learned my name. And just before I drifted away, I thought of how remarkable it is that a heart can mend, not by forgetting its fractures, but by learning to live beautifully around them. In the dark, the house creaked once, the sound of wood settling into rest, and I understood that peace had finally chosen to stay.